Hello and welcome back to Kinesiology 404. My name is Richard Armenta, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about a brief history of public health and epidemiology. As a field, epidemiology is relatively new as a formal scientific discipline, with really much of the methods that we use to understand health and determine disease causality coming from the 19th and 20th century and many more in the last 50 to 100 years for us to really understand what's going on with our health as a population and determine factors that are causing adverse health outcomes. However, the practice of conducting epidemiologic studies and research is not new, and counting health and disease in the population goes back centuries. And so the goal of this lecture will be to briefly introduce you to some of the major points in history and some of the major people who have helped shape what public health is today and what epidemiology is today, and helped us get to the point of where we can better understand factors that are associated with health in our communities. And so on this slide, you'll see a list of 17 different events or people in the history of public health and epidemiology. And this is a non-exhaustive list of events and people that I think are important for us as a class and for you as a student in public health and epidemiology to understand kind of what we've done throughout our history to help protect the health of our communities and how we've really evolved. And some of the things that you'll learn about while looking through the history of epidemiology might shock you and might make you think, how did we not know that sooner? Or why didn't we do something about that earlier? But it's really because our knowledge about health has evolved from being something where we didn't even know what viruses and bacteria were to now us being able to do genetic sequencing and better understand how genes in our environment interact and how health is shaped overall in the population. So what your goal is for this lecture and for this first part of the class will actually be to choose a person in the history of epidemiology and public health and to dive a little bit deeper into the history of what they contributed to our knowledge about health and to our knowledge within the field of public health and epidemiology. And so this part of the class is actually related to your first discussion forum. And this is going to be the first part of that discussion forum where you're going to choose a person or event in the history of epidemiology or public health. That can either come from the list here on this slide, or you can choose somebody that maybe you know about that's not on this list that you're interested in studying more about. But if you do that, I'd recommend that you email me to make sure that it's appropriate for this class. And write a 1 to 2 paragraph, minimum of 300 words, that reports out on the era or particular event or person, providing the most important aspects of that era, event, or person. And that event or person, like I said, doesn't have to be from the list I provided, but I do recommend that you email me in case it's not something that's appropriate for this class to get it approved before you write on it for this discussion forum. And so once you choose that, you're going to go through and talk about that particular person or event so that your classmates can read up a little bit more on them. One caveat to this is that any person or event can only be done by 2 students. So before you get started, you'll have to look at the discussion forum to make sure that somebody else hasn't already selected that person or event. And you'll have to choose something different if 2 people have already done that one. And I'll give you more details on this via email and a separate document as well. So let's just dive in, and as I said, because you're going to be looking more into depth than most of these people, I'm going to give you a very brief synopsis of why I think some of them are important in our history of epidemiology and public health. So starting back with Hippocrates, the first epidemiologist, he explained disease occurrence from a rational rather than supernatural viewpoint. In his essay titled On Airs, Water, and Places, he suggested that environmental and host factors such as behaviors might influence the development of disease. And really, he's one of the first people who recommended that we go out and be in nature, and that nature is good for our health. So if we move forward many, many years, we can look at Thomas Sydenham, who is the founder of clinical medicine and epidemiology, and an English physician who advanced useful treatments and remedies including exercise, fresh air, and a healthy diet, which other physicians rejected at the time and said weren't good for our health. Then there's James Grant, who employed quantitative methods to explore population statistics, including things like tracking deaths, births, and disease, so that we can get really that descriptive epidemiology of what was going on in our population. We have James Lind, who is really tells us about the story of scurvy, where he did one of what we would call the first clinical trials or research studies to look at how vitamin D deficiency was leading to the spread of disease aboard ships in the Royal Navy. And so he was able to examine that people who had vitamin C deficiency were more likely to get scurvy, and that when they supplemented vitamin C, that scurvy went away for most people. And then we have Onesimus, who was an African slave in Boston. He introduced the process that we call variolation against smallpox in the United States well before who you'll learn about next, Edward Jenner. And this idea of variolation is where you will take, and we'll talk about this with Edward Jenner now, where you will take essentially material from a patient who's had a particular disease, so in this case smallpox, you'll take a piece of that and you'll put it on another uninfected person and hope for a more mild disease. And this is actually some of the first times where we learned about vaccination, and Edward Jenner is actually the pioneer of the smallpox vaccine. And the way that he did that was through using cowpox, which was a similar disease that was happening in cows that caused very mild illness. And this was a practice that was first used in China and the Ottoman Empire. And then, as you'll see when we read about Onesimus, by people in different countries in Africa to help protect the health of the population. And so essentially what Edward Jenner does was he noticed that dairy maids who got cowpox, which caused a very mild disease, became immune to smallpox. And so what he did is he infected people who got scabs, which were very mild in comparison to smallpox scabs from cowpox. He would take pieces of that scab and he would put it into an uninfected person, and he would normally put it in their nose, because in order for somebody to get a viral infection or a bacterial infection, it has to get into a mucosal membrane in our body, which would be our nose or our mouth, or our vaginal or anal cavities. And so what he did to test this out is he inoculated, essentially put pieces of cowpox in an 8-year-old volunteer's nose, from a cowpox dairy maid, from a dairy maid that had cowpox. And we say volunteer because we know now from ethical principles of research that somebody who is very young, an 8-year-old, probably isn't voluntarily deciding that they want to participate in a study where if this process does not work, they could potentially die from smallpox or from cowpox. And after he put the cowpox in the child's nose for them to become immune to and develop antibodies against the cowpox, he then 6 weeks later exposed the boy to smallpox from a person who had smallpox infection to see whether or not the boy developed smallpox. And indeed, he did not. And so through this process, he was able to determine that inoculation or using the scabs from somebody with cowpox would lead to immunity in most people for smallpox. And that eventually led to our first vaccination against smallpox. So then if we move forward to William Farr, he introduced a national system recording causes of death and developed mortality surveillance, building up a classification of disease for statistical purposes. So William Farr was really one of the first people to start describing descriptive epidemiology statistics on a national level so that we can understand mortality and morbidity in our population. And then that moves us to John Snow, who was able to determine what was leading to the cholera epidemic in London. At the time, most people thought that cholera was spread by air or some miasma that we just breathed in, and there was no actual bacterial cause of cholera. But John Snow thought that it was spread through water. And so to determine how it was spread, he used what we call geographic information systems, or mapping, to determine where people were getting infected. This is not the Jon Snow that we're talking about from Game of Thrones. Instead, we're talking about Jon Snow in the UK, who was a physician to Queen Victoria, and he is considered one of the fathers of modern epidemiology. So cholera was a major problem in England in the mid-19th century. And in the first week of September 1854, there were 600 deaths among people who were living near Broad Street in London. And Jon Snow believed that cholera was transmitted by water. And at the time, public water companies transported the water supply to the Broad Street area of London from polluted parts of the Thames River. And so what Jon Snow did is he did a natural experiment where he mapped out where people were getting cholera and also where people were getting their water from. And what he noticed is that most of the cases of cholera were clustered around the Broad Street water pump, which is where people were getting their water from in that area. And that particular pump got its water from the polluted Thames River, but people in other areas of the city who were getting their water from other pumps that water was coming from an area that was unpolluted portion of the Thames River. And essentially that polluted portion was because there was sewage runoff and other things into the water, which was, so people's waste and feces was being put in the water, and that was then being put in the pump, and people were getting cholera from that contamination of the water. And so through mapping out this process, he did a natural experiment to determine that cholera was caused by water and not air, which was the common thought of the time. And he was able to actually get that pump shut down, have the water sanitized, and reduce the prevalence of cholera overall in London at the time. So moving forward, we have Ignaz Semmelweis, and I encourage you to go and look at one of the more recent Google Doodles that were created, and there's also a video on this as well that Google created because it's important for current events, COVID-19 that we're dealing with now. And in 1846, Semmelweis observed high levels of deaths in mothers with childbed fever or post-birth infections. And he noticed that unclean hands with putrefied cadaver material on student doctors' hands were used to conduct routine daily pelvic exams, and this practice was never questioned. So essentially, doctors weren't trained and weren't regularly washing their hands. And so Semmelweis identified the importance of washing your hands to prevent the spread of disease. And of course, we've all seen the PSAs and the information out there now that really washing your hands should be for a minimum of 20 seconds to really ensure that they're clean, and you should use soap and vigorous scrubbing of your hands to clean them properly. And then we move forward to Robert Koch, who with Pasteur established the germ theory of disease, where they were really able to determine that there were germs and it wasn't just things floating in the air that were leading to disease in our population. And he came up with Koch's postulates, which we'll go over in a later lecture in class, that demonstrated the association between some microorganism or some germ and a disease. Then when we move forward into the 19th and earliest 20th centuries, we really were early on focusing on infectious diseases. And one thing that I encourage some people to look up is the Spanish flu, especially because it's very analogous to some of the events that we're dealing with today. And the Spanish flu, or pandemic influenza, killed 50 to 100 million people and infected a large portion of the world's population. And so it was a very important event in the history of the world globally and our understanding of the spread of infectious diseases. And then we move forward to 1966. We have Lupe Hernandez, who was the inventor of hand sanitizer. And she really talked about and so I would encourage some of you to look at where hand sanitizer comes from and how important that is for our sanitation today. And then lastly, the 20th century, where we've had what we call this epidemiologic transition in high-income countries towards non-communicable diseases. So what we've really seen over the last 100 years or so, especially with the increase in vaccinations and vaccine-preventable diseases, in antibiotics, and in other treatments, including better medical care, we've seen a large reduction in infectious diseases or not overall globally, though as you'll see next lecture, there's still a large number of deaths from infectious diseases, and really a transition towards more preventable or non-communicable diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and other associated health outcomes. And so that transition has really led us to a shift in what we're facing in the health of our population. But alarmingly, in many areas, and even today, we're still facing a huge burden of infectious diseases in combination with non-communicable or chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, which makes the treatment of both conditions more challenging. So remember that you will be adding on additional information to one of these events in the history of epidemiology, or more information about one of the important people in the history of epidemiology. Do your first discussion forum post. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. More information will also be posted via email and on Kruger courses. Thank you.